This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 18 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And for today's episode, I want to recap some key observation and trends following the completion of Week 3 of the NFL season. Now, this episode every week, I will review the things that stood out to me the most, the good and the bad, observations and trends that matter in both redraft and dynasty. But before we get into the Week 3 key observations and trends, you can follow the show and interact with us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. Now verified. Again, it's at FFAlchemistPod. Or you can email the show at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now, the first observation I wanted to discuss today is what is going on with the Titans backfield between Derrick Henry and rookie Tyjae Spears. Now, through three games, rookie Tyjae Spears has outsnapped Derrick Henry in 2 of those 3 games. In Week 1, Spears had a slightly higher snap count, but Henry still had far more opportunities in that Week 1 game. Opportunities are rushes plus targets. Henry had 18 to 7 opportunities compared to Spears. However, in Week 3, that changed quite a bit. It was much closer to 50-50. Spears again had a higher snap count, but Henry's opportunity count was only 11 compared to 8 for Tyjae Spears. So there's 2 things going on here. The first, and what is the most important, is that Derrick Henry is most certainly on the decline from an age and a performance standpoint. Over his career, he's averaged over 4 yards a carry his entire career, and he was above 5 yards per carry at his peak in 2019 and in 2020. Even last year, Derrick Henry was still at 4.1 yards per carry. However, Derrick Henry has dropped to 3.2 yards per carry through 3 games so far this year. And he's just had his worst fantasy performance given his usage of his entire career last week in Week 3. And of all of Henry's advanced metrics, those are down too. If you compare all of 2022 to the first 3 games of 2023, Henry's yards before contact is down from 1.3 to 0.5. His yards after contact is down from 3.1 to 2.7, and his broken tackle rate is down from 11% to only 4% so far this year. However, Tyjae Spears' advanced metrics are significantly better through the first 3 games. You see, Spears is averaging 5.5 yards per carry. Spears is averaging half a yard better before contact. He's averaging a yard and a half better after contact, and his broken tackle rate is almost 7 times higher than Derrick Henry, 27% to 4%. Beyond that, Spears is already the primary passing down back, and he's getting a higher snap share in negative game scripts. So this is the second piece. The Titans are a bad team, they're a bad offense, and they are finding themselves in negative game scripts like they did in Week 3 against the Browns. Now, if that trend continues, where the Titans find themselves down in games and they start to lose many of their games through the first half of the season, you're going to continue to see Tyjae Spears' snap count increase. And the main concern as we get into the second half of the season is that Derrick Henry's on the last year of his contract, so is Ryan Tannehill. If this season is lost pretty quickly with a subpar offense, the Titans could choose to lean towards their younger players looking towards next year. That would mean more opportunities for Tyjae Spears in the second half of the season, and he's already outperforming Henry on the opportunities that he does get. We need to talk about just how bad the Atlanta Falcons offense is from a fantasy standpoint and how it just cannot support any pass catchers. Now in Week 3, the Falcons' target distribution by position, the tight end position got 50% of the targets, the running back position got 22%, the wide receiver unit only got 28% of the target distribution in Week 3. On top of that, they were in a negative game script against the Lions, and Desmond Ridder, who quite frankly has not been an upgrade in any way, shape, or form to Marcus Mariota. Desmond Ridder had a 55% completion rate in a negative game script with no touchdowns. Sadly, Drake London, who I absolutely love as a talent, but sadly, Drake London is closer to being droppable than he is startable. And then the other special talent that they have, tight end Kyle Pitts, the good news is that we have seen his targets rise every single week. In week 1, he had 3, week 2, 5, and last week, week 3, he was up to 9 targets. But his catch rate is barely over 50%. More on that here in a moment. He hasn't broken 50 yards receiving yet in a game. And Kyle Pitts has no touchdowns. The Falcons as a team only have 2 passing touchdowns through 3 games. Bijan Robinson has 1, Drake London has the other. And this offense just cannot support its pass catchers. This is courtesy of Josh Larkey on Twitter. If you count the number of PPR points per game above 10 for wide receivers and tight ends by team so far through the first 3 weeks, the Minnesota Vikings lead the league in instances where their wide receivers and tight ends have at least had 10 fantasy points in a game. They have 11 instances of that. Right behind them are the Chargers, the Lions, and the Saints with 8. A bunch of teams right in the middle, as you would expect. And then way at the bottom are the Atlanta Falcons with 1. One player from 1 game so far in a 3-game sample that broke 10 PPR points. That was Drake London last week. Look, the offensive environment matters for pass catchers in fantasy. Sadly, I'll just continue to say you cannot start Drake London or Kyle Pitts in redraft, but I do love both as dynasty targets. And then to illustrate why I do love Pitts as a dynasty buy is that he is an elite talent in a terrible situation for fantasy. If you look at the target leaders at the tight end position and then correspond that with their catchable target rate, it is eye-opening. Here's the top 10 target leaders at tight end with their corresponding catch rate. TJ Hawkinson, 89%. Sam Laporta, 82%. Evan Ingram, 95%. Zach Ertz, 90%. Darren Waller, 80%. George Kittle, 89%. Hunter Henry, 83%. Jake Ferguson, 88%. Travis Kelce, 94%. Right, everyone's between 80 to 95%. And then there's Kyle Pitts, 53% catchable target rate. He is stuck on a bad offense in a low volume pass attempt with a terrible quarterback. He is a supreme talent that you should still be acquiring in Dynasty, but from a redraft standpoint, you just cannot have him in your starting lineup. I do quickly want to talk about the Cleveland Browns offense because they had a pretty good week 3 with Deshaun Watson rebounding pretty strongly, but what I wanted to look at was the opportunity count in week 3. Again, opportunities are rushes plus targets. Now, Jerome Ford, the backup running back who's now taken over for Nick Chubb, he led the team with 13 opportunities in week 1. Elijah Moore was second with 12 opportunities, and then Amari Cooper was at 8. Now, for a team I think that has a lot of skill position depth, their opportunity share is very concentrated on these 3 players. However, there is a massive difference in role, especially when we talk about Moore and Cooper. Through 3 games, Cooper and Moore are almost identical in snap count, routes run, and target share. They're each at just about 25%. But the difference is that Cooper's routes and targets are much further down the field. Cooper has an average depth of target of 16.1 compared to Elijah Moore's 7.5. And in week 3, this was exaggerated even more. Cooper had 75% of the team's air yards, while Moore was used almost exclusively around the line of scrimmage. You see, Elijah Moore led the team with 9 targets in week 3, but he only had an average depth of target of 1.2. The only way Elijah Moore continues to have any fantasy value at all is that he continues to get a high target volume. Without it, he's pretty limited from a fantasy standpoint. Next, I want to talk about the Detroit Lions, who will be in the Thursday night game this week. So looking back at week 3, 1 positive and 1 negative. First, let's start with the positive, and that is rookie Sam Laporta. He's an absolute stud, and congrats to those who got him in both redraft and especially in Dynasty. Now, in week 3, Sam Laporta had 11 targets on 29 routes. That's a 39% target per route run rate, which is just exceptional for a guy who's in his 3rd career game. All 3 games this season, Sam Laporta has had at least a 75% snap participation. He is second on the team in targets after 3 weeks. His target count per week has gone 5, 6, 11, Obviously, he found the end zone in week 3, which has led to his fantasy points going from 11.4 to 13.8 to 26.4 last week. Sam Laporta is just an absolute stud, like I said. This is a guy who should be locked in as a starter every single week, and I think already, even 3 games into his career, should be considered a top 5 dynasty tight end. Now, on the downside, I'm a little disappointed by what I saw from their other rookie in Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, Gibbs had 60% snap participation, so he broke 50% for the first time this season without David Montgomery in the lineup. Now, that's good news, right? His rushing numbers went significantly up. His rushing opportunities were up. However, his target opportunities were way down. He only got 1 target on 17 routes. That's 6%, which is really poor considering what he got in the previous 2 weeks. For Jahmyr Gibbs to have value in your starting lineup every week, he requires both snap participation and target volume to be a viable starter. So far, he has not gotten both of those components through 3 games, and sadly, I think he needs to be on your bench until we start to see both of those play out. Packers quarterback Jordan Love has just been an absolute fantasy conundrum for me. All of his advanced metrics point to a guy who should not be performing as well as he is from a fantasy standpoint, but he's done it for 3 straight weeks. Again, in week 3, he had a very poor completion rate. He only completed 50% of his passes in week 3. His touchdown to completion ratio is way ahead of league average. He currently has 7 passing touchdowns plus 1 rushing touchdown last week. So 7 passing touchdowns to 1 interception on only 51 completions. That ratio is way outside the league norm and, quite frankly, should not continue. He should be regressing. He has 3 straight multi-touchdown games when you count his rushing touchdown from week 3. And like I said, his rushing is a component that I thought was not going to be there, but it was in week 3. He had 39 rushing yards plus the rushing touchdown, right? That's an additional 10 points just on rushing alone that I would not expect him to give you week in and week out. But every week he has been somewhere between 20 to 25 fantasy points. He has consistently been inside the top 10. He's currently quarterback 4 on the season, and he is still without his top weapons, right? His number 1 wide receiver, Christian Watson, and I think his number 1 overall best weapon in Aaron Jones. It looks like both of those players could be back for the Thursday night game. So Jordan Love is definitely a player I will continue to watch very intensely, and something just has to give. Either Jordan Love is going to have to start playing better when it comes to his advanced metrics, and maybe the talent around him can elevate that, or the good luck that he has had will run out and he will regress to the league norm, and we'll be looking at a guy who is average at best. Now let's talk about the Miami Dolphins, and in particular Devon Achane, who just exploded on the scene in week 3, which is kind of his first game back after having an injury through most of the preseason. He didn't play. He was scratched in week 1, barely played in week 2, and obviously now was a feature player here in week 3. Now, let's talk about the good. I mean, Devon Achane had 51.3 fantasy points on only 30 snaps played. He had 4 total touchdowns. He had 200 yards rushing, another 2 receiving touchdowns. He was just incredible. Now, I also look back. I mean, 51 points is just, it's absurd considering how few snaps he played. I looked back the last 2 years, any running back who played less than 30 snaps, the highest fantasy point score of that group was only 22 points, right? Achane went 2.5 above that. Achane went over 11 yards per carry in his week 3 performance, and he had a crazy high 36% target per route run rate. He got 4 targets on only 11 routes run. Now, let's talk about the downside to this. I think a lot of people went out and spent big, maybe even 100% of their fab dollars on Devon Achane, and I get it. Nope. A guy scores 51 points in a week, you have to snag him up. But the downside is that Achane only played in 41% of snaps. Salvon Ahmed was out with an injury. Jeff Wilson is still eligible to return to IR. This game got out of hand really quickly. The Dolphins played a very high number of snaps. Dolphins passed on only 40% of their plays in week 3 compared to the previous 2 weeks, and both were competitive games, the Dolphins passed on 60% of their plays in weeks 1 and 2 compared to the 40% in week 3. So my concern is that Devon Achane's opportunities are going to come down and come down quite a bit. We're not going to have these sort of blowout games every single week where Devon Achane can get this amount of opportunities. His competition for snaps is going to increase. The amount of pass plays the Dolphins are going to run is going to be much higher. Their number of snaps is typically going to be a little bit lower. Devon Achane, to me, profiles as the ultimate boom-bust type player week in and week out. I would be very cautious about starting him in my lineup. And then the last thing I'll say specifically related to Devon Achane in dynasty leagues, this is a guy who has climbed dramatically in his dynasty value after one game. He has gone all the way to running back 12 in dynasty rankings after this one performance. If I can get running back 12 value out of Devon Achane, that is a trade I would easily make. When these guys have these sort of spike weeks, their value typically comes back down over time. So selling Devon Achane right now at his peak value is something I would advise if I can get that running back 12 value. One running back I am going to have to take the L on the season is Commanders running back Antonio Gibson. I was high on Gibson all offseason. I thought he was going to be the guy for the Commanders, but he is just not produced. And this is the week he should have done it. He actually outsnapped Brian Robinson for the first time in week 3, 33-20 in what was a clearly negative game script where the Bills were all over the Commanders from the get-go. But unfortunately, it just did not translate to anything meaningful from a fantasy production standpoint. Gibson still had fewer opportunities than Robinson. Opportunities are rushes plus targets. Robinson had 10 opportunities to 6 for Gibson. And Gibson only saw a target on 14% of his routes. Look, Gibson sadly can be dropped in redraft. He's still a guy I would like to acquire in Dynasty if I can get him for a third, but that's all I'd be willing to pay for right now. Another running back with some alarming usage is Seahawks running back Kenneth Walker. Now, Walker has seen his snap participation drop every week. Week 1, he was at 63%, week 2 at 60%, and then at week 3, it dropped to 51%. Now, it didn't matter in week 3 because he still had 97 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. But Walker is dominating the early down and the short yardage, but he is ceding third down and the 2-minute drill to rookie Zach Charbonnet. Now, if Walker is only playing half the snaps with a limited target volume, which is what we saw in week 3, I think he's nothing more than a touchdown-dependent start every week. And then I would add, if Zach Charbonnet is available on your waiver wire, that should be a premium target to go pick up for free. Charbonnet has some standalone value right now, but if Walker was to be injured, Charbonnet, I think, skyrockets into at least a top 25, if not top 20, weekly ranking at the running back position. Now I want to talk about my boy, Jake Ferguson, the tight end for the Cowboys. Look, he continues to impress, given his small sample size. But most importantly, in week 3, his routes run and his snap participation increased quite a bit. His routes run in week 3 was at 29 routes. He averaged 15 per game in weeks 1 and 2. And his route participation broke 50%. He was at 52%. He averaged 33% per game in weeks 1 and 2. Now Ferguson, he is second on the team in targets, and he has the highest target per route run rate for the Dallas Cowboys. Look, it's just as simple as he needs more route volume, and he's starting to get it. Week 3 could be the beginning of it. Jake Ferguson is definitely a guy I think that is on the rise. Panthers wide receiver Adam Thielen was a borderline rosterable player at the beginning of the season. However, in week 3, he was wide receiver 3 on the week with 31.5 fantasy points. He had 14 targets, 11 receptions, 145 yards, a touchdown. He got a target on 25% of his routes run. Now, Bryce Young was out of the game, and I think he's likely to be out again in week 4, and Andy Dalton was hyper-targeting Adam Thielen. Jonathan Mingo, the rookie, who I think had more rapport with Bryce Young, left with a concussion. I think he could be out as well. That leaves Thielen as the primary target hog for the Panthers again, with Andy Dalton back in the lineup. Thielen was available in almost 50% of ESPN leagues ahead of the Week 3 waivers. Now, since I was talking about Adam Thielen, there's three other wide receivers above the age of 30 that are absolutely dominating right now that I want to talk about. First, Chargers wide receiver Keenan Allen. Now, we probably should have seen this coming because Keenan Allen, when he returned from a hamstring injury in week 11 of last season, he has had the highest PPR point per games on average across the entire league. He's averaging 21.9 points from week 11 on last year to week 3 this year. That's ahead of Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, and Devontae Adams, who are the next three behind him. He is currently wide receiver 1 on the season. He is catching 82% of his targets, which is just incredible. All the other top fantasy producing wide receivers are somewhere in the 60 to 70% catch range. And Allen is getting a third of the total target share on one of the highest passing volume offenses in the league. He's getting a target on every 1/3 of his routes run, and he has a third of the team's air yards. And now Mike Williams is out for the season. Keenan Allen is a stud, and as long as he remains healthy, he is going to be a league winner for those who drafted him. Another one is Mike Evans. Now, through 3 weeks, Mike Evans is currently wide receiver 5 in PPR points. He is 8th in target share at 31.5. He's 2nd in air yardage at 50.3% of the team's air yards. And according to Fantasy Points data, he is 8th in first read target share at 37%. Evans has scored a touchdown in every game so far this year, and Evans only had 6 touchdowns last year, but historically he has been a double-digit touchdown scorer, and again, he is now well on pace to do that again here in 2023. Now, Mike Evans isn't running as many routes as some of his other elite counterparts, but he has run, just to illustrate that, he's run half as many routes as Keenan Allen, for example, but he does make up for that by commanding targets. Evans is getting a target on nearly half of his routes run, and he is exactly half of the Bucs' air yards through 3 weeks. And then the other stud receiver in his 30s, of course, is Raiders wide receiver Devontae Adams. He is coming off a monster performance, 20 targets, 172 yards, 2 touchdowns. He's currently wide receiver 4 on the season. He is the one who has unreal target dominance. He has 39% target share through 3 games. That's the highest in the league. He is getting a target on over a third of his routes with an average depth of target over 11 yards. And most importantly, he has over half, 52% of the Raiders' air yards through 3 games. It's the highest in the league. Mike Evans and Tyreek Hill are the only other players in the 45 to 50% range in team air yard shares, and a host of others are in the 40 to 45% range, but Adams is at 50%. Now, what's interesting is that all these players were vastly underdrafted compared to their early season results. Average ADP at the start of September had Adams as wide receiver 6 at the top of the 2nd round. Keenan Allen was wide receiver 18 in the mid to late 4th round, and Mike Evans was wide receiver 30 in the mid 7th round. And look, every year there is a clear age bias, and rightfully so. We have concerns over age, career usage, prior injuries, changes in quarterback, right? We can do this with all of these guys. They're all over the age of 30. They've played for almost a decade. You look at prior injuries. Keenan Allen missed half of the season last year with a hamstring injury. Devontae Adams had a change at quarterback. Mike Evans had a significant change at quarterback, going from the greatest of all time in Tom Brady to Baker Mayfield. There's reasons to be concerned. And I am one of those players who can be guilty of that bias because I don't want to be the one left holding the bag when the end is apparent. For example, we previously discussed Derrick Henry. Many analysts were very concerned last year that that would be the year that Derrick Henry finally fell off a cliff given his age and his career usage. And it didn't happen last year. But it is happening this year. It turns out they were right. They were just a year too early. And I think a lot of people were concerned about Allen and Evans and Adams to varying degrees, which is why they weren't valued where they were in their ADP. But I also think this is a good lesson for redraft leagues in future years because targeting proven veterans who have a strong record of producing in fantasy can typically yield strong results. And we are seeing that right now with Adams, Allen, and Evans. Now, one other player I should mention too, since I was talking about the Raiders, is receiver Jacoby Myers. He is currently wide receiver 20 overall, but he's actually wide receiver 5 in points per game because he missed week 2. Now, Myers' target share in those 2 weeks playing opposite Devontae Adams is 31% and 27%. Myers is also roughly getting a target on a third of his routes, and he makes up a third of the team's air yards. Adams and Myers together are getting hyper usage, better than any other tandem in the league through 3 weeks. So that'll wrap up key observations and trends from week 3 of the NFL season. Make sure you like and subscribe. We'll be back before Friday with some key recommendations on who you should not be afraid to start heading into week 4 of the fantasy season. So for Dustin Chandry signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.